All right, fantastic. So, brief recap for those of you who have been watching out there. We started out with addressing the central fulcrum of almost all Calvinist arguments, an ongoing quest for an undisputed authority so they can ultimately redefine reality however they see fit. Their endless appeal to all things biblical is because they believe that is where they borrow their authority. They borrow this distant authority, apply it to themselves, and so that they can ultimately dictate to you whatever it is they think they want you to know. So that's what that was and then for the next section I actually talked about some specific arguments that they use to actually control you in context to my web of tyranny, so that you can understand how abolition of ambition and collective conformity, how those arguments fit together to continue to keep you subservient, intellectually subservient, and willing to abandon your individuality in an effort to, well, remain conformed to the church, and their definition of reality. So that's kind of the very thumbnail sketch of what brings us to where we are right this minute. Now, I closed out the last session saying that you had to successfully advocate for your own individuality. And here is why this is so crucial. Tyranny cannot sustain and it cannot thrive in a world of self-confident individuals. Tyranny requires your selective and deliberate subordination to whoever's in charge. So the confident man, the confident individual, the thinking man, is not inclined. He will not be subdued. He will not willingly be subdued. He will fight back. So ultimately what we have to successfully do is get comfortable with the fact that we need to be able to defend our individuality. Now, I told you starting out that I was going to talk a little bit about John Locke. And John Locke is a key figure in the course of human events. Now, the unfortunate part of John Locke's philosophy is that about 2/3 of what he said was really, truly a disaster philosophically. And it opened up, effectively, his sub-arguments, his original arguments, were then taken on by men like Bishop Berkeley and David Hume. And in pretty short order, the whole philosophical landscape collapses into skepticism. Pardon me. And the effects, the success of what was the Age of Reason begins to fall apart from that point. So by the time we get to David Hume, the next evolution is a man by the name of Immanuel Kant. And from Immanuel Kant, the Western world, Western philosophy collapses altogether. So that's the bad part of Locke's ideas. But his good part was equally successful. As bad as his bad part was, his good part was even better. Pardon me. John Locke did three things that ultimately culminated, he had made a series of arguments, two different places. One was from a letter concerning toleration, and the other one was his second treaty of government. And in these two documents, he laid a very profound foundation that ultimately culminates in the American Constitution, and specifically the separation of church from the state. Now, I want to talk about this because this foundation is what has given America the foundation of political autonomy and political freedom and limited government. This is an essential thing to understand in the defense of your individualism, because his arguments are really the validation of the individual in context to a civil society. So I'm going to talk about this. The second part of what I'm going to talk about is, and I did not actually bring my book up. In a minute, you guys can bring up the book, the other book there.
This one?
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah, in a minute, you can bring it up. So let's review. Now, I did a full evaluation of John Locke's doctrine, I think in in John Locke's philosophy in 2014. Yeah, go ahead. Just bring it up. I did a full evaluation of John Locke's work in 2014. It was extended, and frankly, it's exhausting, so this is a much more condensed one. I decided to focus this down to some primary points. The first thing I wanted to talk about is from his letter concerning toleration. I'm going to read to you. So, since you are pleased to inquire what are my thoughts about the mutual toleration of Christians and their different professions of religion, I must needs answer you freely that the true church, that I esteem that toleration to be the chief characteristic mark of the true church. For whatsoever some people boast of the antiquity of places and names, or of the pomp of their outward worship, others of the reformation of their discipline, all of the orthodoxy of their faith, for everyone is orthodox to himself. These things and all others of this nature are much rather marks of men striving for power and empire over one another than of the Church of Christ. In the second place, the care of souls cannot belong to the civil magistrate, because his power consists only in outward force. But true and saving religion consists in the inward persuasion of the mind, without which nothing can be acceptable to God. And such is the nature of the understanding, that it cannot be compelled to the belief of anything by outward force. Confiscation of estate, imprisonment, torments, nothing of that nature can have any such efficacy as to make men change the inward judgment that they have framed of things. I may indeed be alleged that the magistrate may make use of arguments, and thereby draw the heterodox into the way of truth, and procure their salvation. I grant it. But this is common to him with other men. In teaching, instruction, and redressing the erroneous by reason, he may certainly do what becomes any good man to do. Magistracy does not oblige him to put off either humanity or Christianity. But it is one thing to persuade, another to condemn, one thing to press with arguments, and another with penalties. This civil power alone has a right to do, and to the other, goodwill is authority enough. This, among others, in his letter concerning toleration, was a powerful argument against the algebra of orthodoxy that I talked to you at the very beginning. Historically, orthodoxy and the people controlling the definition of orthodoxy has always been about merging political force, civil force, with the doctrine. This is, of course, why almost immediately after John Calvin writes his Institutes, he becomes one of the main political figures in Geneva, and in very short order they have religious theocracy. In every instance, Protestant Christianity must push for, Reformed theology must push for, a solidarity with civil government and religious orthodoxy, because it must be able to control the definition of reality. That's what it has to have. And you can only do that if you can burn people at the stake. John Locke, speaking, roughly 150 years later, I think, successfully identifies that the role of the magistrate cannot be the role of the soul saver. They cannot be the same person. And John Locke accepts the premise that human reason is sufficient to the cause of his own consciousness, and that man cannot be compelled by force to believe any given orthodoxy. And he makes the correct assertion that everybody's orthodox to himself, which is pretty much the point that I've been making this whole weekend. That in the John Piper video, what was his real true definition of what was the definition of biblical? Well, whatever he happened to believe. When we talked about Grace Rider Randy, at the end of the day, whatever the Calvinist believes is what's biblical. Whatever's biblical is whatever the Calvinist believes. He successfully creates the philosophical distinction between the role of religion and the role of government force. And this, of course, when you watch the philosophical tides come across the Atlantic and land in the New World, the closest America ever got to the Dark Ages was the Massachusetts theocracy. The framers of our Constitution were absolutely sure that that Massachusetts theocracy should never be given the ability to grow in ascendancy. The separation of church and state was designed to limit that fundamental power. Why? Because they didn't want the magistrate using force to compel people from heterodoxy into orthodoxy. In other words, political correctness in religious terms, right? He goes on to say here, it will be answered, undoubtedly, that it is the Orthodox Church which has the right of authority over the erroneous or heretical. This is, in great and specious words, to say that nothing at all. Every church is orthodox to itself, and other erroneous, others to others, or heretical. I don't think I read that last one. Every church is orthodox to itself, to others erroneous or heretical. And this is the fundamental conflict within all Protestant Christianity. Everybody wants to pretend that their definition of what orthodox is the correct one. And so everybody outside that specific definition, therefore, by definition, is in error. So the only question within Protestant Christianity is who has the right to compel you to believe what? And the only way to answer that question is who's got the biggest guns, or in ancient times, who had the most swords. It is always a question of who has the most force. That's the sum of it. And he is ultimately arguing against this at the root. So the controversy between these churches about the truth of their doctrines and the purity of their worship is on both sides equal. Nor is there any judge, either in Constantinople or elsewhere upon the earth, by whose sentences can be determined. Men being by nature all free, equal, and independent, no one can put out this estate and subject it to the political power of another without consent. Oh, wait a minute. I just jumped a section. Hang on a second. We'll get back to that. John Locke's argument successfully made toleration the fundamental principle of Christian doctrine. He pointed out that those bragging of their spiritual pedigree and doctrinal orthodoxy were really seeking political power and hiding behind the name of Jesus. The only thing that saves man is what happens by persuasion of the mind. Souls cannot be won with government force. Notice, Locke fully believes that man's salvation resides in his choice to follow rational arguments. Notice how these arguments go to the heart of our 21st century conflict. At every turn, the Calvinists are returning to the primordial ooze of these historical doctrines. The right to sustain dictatorial power over the course of your intellectual individuality. And the point here is that they all think their orthodoxy is the sum of their own mind. And you have no obligation to subordinate your mind to theirs. Now, he successfully separates out or lays the foundation for arguing against the unity of political force with government power. But he also went on to successfully, in his second treaty of government, to lay a foundation for the nature of government as such. In his second chapter on the state of nature, I'm just going to briefly summarize these points. To understand political power correctly, man must first understand his natural state. The natural state is equality. We all individually reside in our existence, reside equally with one another. He's not talking about abilities specifically. He's talking about the nature of our existential framework. We're all equal. We all have the same responsibilities, the satisfaction of our lives, and the means and methods to do that. All people are born with the same advantages of nature. His logic extends. This means that God would not have appointed some men to subjugate others. Notice this is a root argument against the premise of slavery. As a side note, does anyone else think it is highly ironic for a bunch of Calvinists, a bunch of Presbyterians to be arguing about white privilege today? You do realize that about 150 years ago, those same Calvinist preachers arguing about white privilege, it was the white privilege of the white man to enslave the black man. I just thought I'd throw that out there. The law that governs the state of nature is reason, man in his natural state. The way man interacts with his own existence, the way he solves the problems of his life is by reason. Reason touches all men, that all men are equal and independent. Section 6 of the second chapter, the state of nature is a state of liberty. The law of reason says that since man may harm no other man's life, health, or liberty, or possessions, there is no subordination among men that authorizes one to destroy the other. And inasmuch as a man preserves his life, he must also seek to aid in the preservation of another's liberty, health, limb, or property. This is a very different social organization than had ever been conceived before. Up till now, when he's speaking, man was effectively the byproduct of the collective, whatever the state, whatever that happened to be. And in specific context, man was necessarily, each individual man was a subunit, a cog in the wheel of the church. And therefore, his life was irrelevant as long as the collective ruled. He's basically saying, no, individuals are the primary, and the primary means of existing in nature are all universal. All of us deal with nature and solve our problems by reason. And because I must be free to do what I need to do to survive, that also means there is a reciprocal responsibility to not cause harm to other individuals in the same pursuit. Section 7 says, reason, the law of nature, wills peace and the preservation of man. Therefore, the law of nature puts in everyone's hand the right to punish the transgressor of reason and to hinder the violation of reason with violence. This is a crucial distinction. I do not have the right to impose myself upon you or take and steal what you have. But in the event that I do that, you have the moral right to defend against it and to prevent it by violence.
And to assist others in the same, and to assist others who are having violence perpetrated against them.
That is exactly right.
Which is the foundation for warfare. Well, the only valid
foundation. He actually calls it a state of war.
Yeah.
He saw that. He sees the act of initiating violence entering what is called a state of war, and it is the moral obligation of free men committed to reason and liberty to use violence to repel that action. And his other consecutive point is that this is not a role reserved for other people. In other words, you don't suddenly put on a badge and become the only person in the room that has the ability to use force to stop things. Basically, it is a collective responsibility to the exact same end. So here is a summary. Reason is man's primary means of living in the world. All men are equal. The function of violence is to protect the reasonable. Why? Because reason is how we solve our problems and work in context to our existence. There is no special appointment of government force. In other words, you don't get government force because God appoints it. Or said another way, there are no church elders who hold a monopoly on church discipline. So, he starts out with the state of nature. He makes a series of other arguments, but the next one of importance to us is property, which is chapter 5 in his second treaty of government. Locke's definition of property is an essential evolution of thought. He correctly establishes the roots of private property. Property is the product of labor. So, as you go about solving the problems of your own existence, namely feeding yourself, clothing yourself, housing yourself, you have artifacts of that process, whatever that happens to be. That is your work product. That is the outcome of your labor. Individuals employ their industry to create the substance of their life. Man in the state of nature must work to survive. There is an unbreakable relationship between your employment of reason, the product of your work, of your labor, and your ability to enjoy that labor unharassed. Seizing man's property is the same as seizing a man's life. Locke correctly identifies that man is indivisible from his work. He correctly integrates human existence by identifying that reason is the root of man's production. When you get up every day, I don't care whether you're digging a ditch or building a skyscraper, at the end of the day, the thing that makes it possible for you to dig the best ditch and build the best skyscraper is because you are rationally inclined to successfully identify reality on whatever level that requires to achieve that outcome. Thus, man's life and man's property are corollaries of existence. By contrast, historically, man has always been a cog in the wheel of the collective. Therefore, the work that he does is the rightful property of the collective. John Locke says no. It's exactly the opposite. Each individual encounters existence and uses reason to overcome whatever is required for the substance and success of his own life. Which means that the production in that pursuit is rightfully his. Does that make sense? So we start with the correct identification of human existence, reason in the state of nature, liberty and reason. Then we move to the production, what is required of us to actually produce the success and prosperity of our life, which is private property. Then he goes on to the beginning of political societies. For those of you who want to know, this is Second Treaty of Government, Chapter 8 of the beginning of political societies. It is here that Locke identifies the correct order in social relationships. Historically, it was assumed that the state was the social primary. Men were born into the state, and then their lives were disposed at the will of the state. Now, I want to read from this. Men being by nature all free, equal, and independent, no one can be put out of his estate and subject to the political power of another without consent. A man can only divest himself of his natural liberty and puts on the bonds of civil society by agreeing with other men to join and unite for their comfortable, safe, and peaceable living, one amongst the other, in a secure enjoyment of their properties. This any number of men may do, because it hinders not the freedom of the rest. They are left as they were in the liberty of the state of nature. When any number of men have so consented to make one community or government, they are thereby presently incorporated and make one body politic, wherein the majority have a right to act and to conclude the rest. Notice right here why they agree to join and unite: for their comfortable, safe, and peaceable living amongst one another. Here is his fundamental point. The reason we enter into civil society, civil agreements, is specifically to enjoy the fruits of our labors. You will now recognize this concept expressed in the line in the Declaration of Independence. The reason we enter into political union is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Notice the individual comes first. He willingly joins the political organization for the specific reason of enjoying the product of his own life. And he does it in its self-defense. And by doing this, willingly entering this relationship, no one is harmed, because no one suffers any reduction in his own personal liberty. This is why this is all done by consent. Here's the progression. Man is first a free sovereign agent. That is the first step. He labors to create property to satisfy his survival and enjoyment. He seeks social relationships to expand his freedom. He consents to social contracts. Government is by consent of the governed. And here's what I think John Locke did. He did the world a great favor. He identified the root of all civilized societies. The root is the individual. The individual's proper state of nature is reason. Private property is the byproduct of created by rational effort. Government and social contracts are the consequence of individual life, liberty, and happiness. You enter into government contracts to protect yourself from encroachment. Thereby, government is subordinated to the individual. John Locke laid the foundation for a peaceful society by placing theological issues firmly in the realm of personal consciousness and delimiting the government purpose. That foundation set the minds of men free, and the light was set forth throughout the earth. But there was one thing that John Locke didn't do. He didn't tell people how to be effective individuals. And it is for this reason we will now turn our attention block to the last building block of individual defense. And that is the discussion of self-esteem. Now, many of you who just heard the word self-esteem come out of my mouth, you started shouting at the computer screen saying, "I knew it, I knew it, I knew it." He's leading us down the road to heresy. Self-esteem has effectively become, let's see what's the next slide here. Self-esteem has effectively become a synonym for human evil. And there's no way for me to disabuse people of that in less than 35, 40 minutes. Paul had up on the screen earlier when he was doing the definitions, he put self-esteem up there. And his definition of biblical self-esteem I thought was pretty good. But Calvinism basically assumes that self-esteem is a synonym for... Self-esteem in the Calvinist worldview is the expectation of personal loathing. If you have self-esteem, you are necessarily evil. So the goal is for you to loathe yourself. And that is the correct expression of your own self-esteem. Now I'm going to introduce you to a thinker that I like. Nathaniel Branden's 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem. This is actually a pretty good book. Probably one of the better ones I've read on the subject. We're going to talk about some cultural myths. He has 6 pillars. We're not going to talk about all 6. I'm going to talk about what I think the 3 primary ones are. Highly recommend you read. Actually, I just made this recommendation earlier. Also, if you have an Audible account, you can find an abridged version of this book on Audible. It's about 3 hours. It's pretty good. If you don't have an Audible account, if you sign up, first month you'll get 1 free credit. You can actually effectively listen to the book for nothing. Highly recommend you wade through. Also, much of what I talk about and what I'm going to talk about here, you will also find in the last chapter of my book. Now, I don't specifically talk about self-esteem as such, but I talk about how to start taking initiative. Once you've been subject to these doctrines for a long time, they are designed to erode your self-appointment. And you can get yourself to a place where you can't make any choices whatsoever. You will if you take the doctrine seriously, you'll get yourself to a place where you have a hard time brushing your teeth unless somebody tells you to. Now, maybe some of you think I'm being silly, but I'm really not. Last chapter in this book, I go into great detail on how to just start the process of becoming self-appointed again. So I highly recommend that. So there are a series of cultural myths I first want to address. The first one is that good self-esteem is to have effectively no self-esteem. That to have self-esteem is necessarily narcissism, and nobody wants to be narcissistic, so if you have self-esteem, that's a bad thing, so what you really want to do is have no self-esteem. But here's the dirty little secret. We all have self-esteem because we all pass judgments on ourselves. And really what we're talking about in the issue of self-esteem is what judgment do I actually apply to my own existence? And there are a couple of different options. We all internally apply moral verdicts to our actions, thoughts, and values. So we have the cultural, pop culture definition of self-esteem. Self-esteem equals moral absolution. In other words, my self-esteem is to apply no moral judgment to my existence. Really, we treat self-esteem more as a coping mechanism that refuses to apply any moral judgment to any personal aspect. So I have self-esteem, I look myself in the mirror, I tell myself I'm great. It doesn't matter what I do or how I did it or what virtues I possess or I don't possess, just as long as I look myself in the mirror and say, hey, you're a good guy, you're really great. That is the definition of self-esteem. But really what you're doing is just trying to apply a Band-Aid to something you really don't possess. You have no moral value, and so you decide you are, or you say to yourself, you know you have no moral value, and so you just try to apply it as a Band-Aid because you really know ultimately you're not doing anything. It's a fraud. We can't help passing judgments on our immoral behaviors. This makes if you choose to assume that self-esteem equals no moral absolution, blanket moral absolution, it's an illusion. The other option is self-esteem equals self-absorption. This is the preoccupation, the narcissist, who is the singular preoccupation with an internal life, openly rejecting existence and the interdependencies of all people and things. So this is the archetypical brute that can't conceptualize his existence in any other context but his own internal reality. And he's an exploiter and a destroyer because he wants to consume for his own whatever. Now, does this person really exist? Maybe. They're very few, and they're usually cultural aberrations. But it is a common mythology that is handed down, and as long as you accept the premise that this is what self-esteem looks like, you'll be inclined to believe that any variation of individuality and self-esteem is really this archetype, when in actual fact, as a rule, no, people are not this way. The last one is, the last cultural myth is that self-esteem is the byproduct of social affirmation. Self-esteem can be created by participation trophies, smiley faces, amoral acceptance of other people. This is a mirage, because ultimately kids that receive participation trophies, no, they didn't do anything. And so it doesn't ultimately mean anything. And so no matter how many times you try to tell people, hey, you did a great job, at the end of the day, the individual cannot help but to pass judgment on what he really did and didn't do. These are not self-esteem, because they either render no judgment on the self or acquire no value from the self. So I said this to you a little bit before, but I want to go over it again. Everything in this web is designed to get you to pass the harshest judgment you can on your own existence. Everything here. You're universally guilty. Everybody, fall of man. You're guilty. You inherit Adam's sin. You're morally reprobate. That depravity here means, in dynamic tension, that everybody is incompetent. You can't make up your own mind, save your life. And this means you can't know anything, and because you can't know anything, you can't be trusted to take moral action. So you need somebody to tell you what to do. So you must judge yourself universally guilty and universally incompetent. All of these doctrines are designed to get you to make the harshest self-judgment you can possibly make. To remain in context to the collective, they're going to ask you to abolish every individual ambition you have. And typically when people hear the word ambition, it's usually like, when they think of ambition, they think, the archetypical stockbroker who just makes deals to destroy things. That his ambition is actually the fundamental flaw. When in actual fact, an ambition is nothing more than a personal improvement. You can have the ambition to eat dinner. A good dinner, So ambition isn't really a problem here. The issue is, in context, your ambition, your goals, the things that you set out to do for yourself, exist in a context to everyone else. And we've already talked about how John Locke explained how you exist in context to the rest of society. So this is Nathaniel Brandon's 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem. This is a quote from his work. Self-esteem is the disposition to experience oneself as a being competent to cope with the basic challenges of life and being worthy of happiness. It is confidence in the efficacy of our mind and our ability to think. By extension, it is confidence in our ability to learn, make appropriate choices and decisions, and respond effectively to change. It is also the experience that success, achievement, fulfillment, happiness are right and natural for us. The survival value of such confidence is obvious. So is the danger when it is missing. There's so much in here that I really like. This is designed to persuade you to lay down your happiness at the root. Because it's designed to persuade you that you're not competent to understand reality for yourself. Self-esteem is knowing that we are competent to cope with the challenges of life and being worthy of happiness. That it's okay to be happy. I'll tell you, I remember some years ago when I was still trying to wade through all this. And I found myself, when I was praying, I would find myself really, really happy about whatever. And then I would find myself praying and apologizing for the fact that I was happy. Because I was scared of the equation that if I was in fact happy, that represented some error on my part. That's how deeply ingrained these doctrines had become. And I remember when I stopped myself one day, I'm like, you know what? I'm not going to apologize for being happy, for enjoying the sum of my life, for liking what I'm doing, liking who I am. And it's a major evolution, because for many people, as they come out of these doctrines, one of the biggest things that will betray them is the fear that they are not allowed to be happy. And if they are in fact happy, there is something spiritually and morally wrong with their existence.
Call it pride.
Yes, they do. They call, well, that's a neat category, but they do. They call it pride. The moment that you demonstrate any individual satisfaction, well, you must be proud. And of course, everybody knows pride is the very thing that God decided that nobody should ever have. So he's going to smite us, right? Self-esteem. It is also the experience that success, achievement, fulfillment, or happiness are right and natural for us. How often do you find yourself second-guessing yourself the moment you realize you've had success? The moment you've done an achievement? And how many times when you're sitting in church do the guys sitting in the pews beside you, the guy up front talking to you, tells you that if you have an achievement, it isn't yours? Or you're Barack Obama and say, well, you didn't build that. You don't have any right to make a claim to the content of your achievements. It is all designed. Everything we're talking about here is designed to beat you down. It's designed to eradicate from you any sense of self-respect. So, why do we need self-esteem? The answer is actually implied here. The survival value of such confidence is obvious. Now, one of the challenges that I think we do have in the modern age, we have gotten as a race, as a species, very good at insulating ourselves from the danger of nature. We all live in pretty hermetically sealed lives. Most of us live a level of prosperity that the rest of the world and the whole of humanity has never really known. And we're inclined to think that it's a given. But it's not. What we would consider to be historical luxuries are the byproduct of a long chain of intellectual conclusions that has produced a prosperity that the whole world has never known. But the world is profoundly dangerous. Most of us in this room, and most of us listening online would be hard-pressed to last a week in the woods by ourselves. Most of us would probably tap out in 48 hours. And it is that distance from nature, which I think is right. Human beings, we don't get anything from nature. The way we work, the way we're built, is to take the content of nature and conform it to our existence, which is exactly right and proper. So, when given over to the elements, we must first and almost immediately figure out how to get the elements away from us so that we are actually successful, we can actually work. Susan actually talked about some of this, not quite in this context, but earlier today, when she was talking about the work that men would have been required to do in the ancient world. And she was right. It was a mad scramble every minute of every day just to stay alive because, oh, by the way, nature was going to kill them if they didn't. So the imperative of survival for us day to day is not the imperative of survival, say, 150 years ago. And so for us, it seems foolish to discuss real peril when it comes to the failure to make individual choice. But the fact of the matter is it isn't any different. If we fail to make rational choices and achieve, have success and fulfillment and happiness, if we fail in that, we will die. And just because we're insulated at the moment doesn't mean we will be insulated forever. The survival mechanism here, the survival standard here is exceedingly high. There is a fantastic danger in failing to understand this. Why do we need self-esteem? The answer is simple and essential. The self-esteem is the need for a consciousness to learn to trust itself. I talk about this in my last chapter of Light in the Vineyard, about making choices. And how hard people find, after they've been subject to going to pastors and constantly vetting the content of their lives through the mind of somebody else. And then suddenly they find themselves out of that environment, they no longer have that endless sounding board, and they have a trouble just figuring out if they want to go buy ice cream at the grocery store. And that for many people, just the choice to go buy ice cream may come with this enormous emotional and intellectual hurdle. You can so atrophy your ability to make choices in this world that you will never be able to trust your own consciousness. And that's why these doctrines are so damn destructive, because they will erode you at the root. A volitional consciousness, one that must make choices, is a mind that must choose to think, or not. Must choose to be rational, or not. Man is not automatically reality focused. This is crucial. We actually have to get up every day and choose to look at reality and understand what it's telling us. How many days have you gone through your life and not really paid any attention whatsoever? You didn't focus at all. You knew there were some choices to make. You knew there were some things that were actually requiring your attention, and you just chose to blank it out and go on. Then one day becomes 2, becomes 10, becomes a month, becomes a year, and suddenly you go look around and you go, holy cow, that's just gotten huge. It's because you chose not to focus. And as such, you chose not to take actions that would actually advance the success and achievements of your own life. Man must intentionally orient his consciousness towards the elements of this life. He doesn't have a choice. This choice is the fundamental of life and death. So, this begs the question, how do we actually go about building this self-esteem? For the sake of time, I'm only going to talk about these 3 pillars. He's got 6, so there's 3 more in the book. The 3 pillars of self-esteem, what it requires of you individually. A practice of living consciously, the practice of self-acceptance, the practice of self-responsibility. Since Calvinists are so hard at redefining reality and undermining your existence, I will focus on these first 3 pillars. Here is the Calvinist myth. Self-esteem equals self-loathing. This is what they want you to believe. Suffering and sacrifice is so drilled into your mind that you will struggle to agree with what I just said. you'll struggle to agree that there is any real value in self-esteem as such, because they will have told you at the root that your existence, its purpose is to suffer. So let's talk about living consciously. Living consciously is a respect for the facts of reality. It's being able to look at reality and understand what it's telling you and arrive at the correct conclusions. Not evading, not hedging, not trying to get out of the way, not trying to shut off your brain and just kind of let go. It is paying attention, deliberately paying attention to the nature of reality. Living consciously is a determination to present each moment, to be present in each moment of action. In other words, you're confronted with a fact of reality, it demands your attention, and you determine just to be there with that. And I actually realized that's actually kind of tough to do. Just being present in the moment, with whatever's happening in the moment. Because you're typically doing one of two things. Reflecting on something back in the past, or projecting out to where you think you want to go next. Which leaves us in this endless limbo right where we stand right this minute. And how many things could successfully be solved if we were just present that moment. Living consciously is an eagerness to acquire information, knowledge, or feedback that impacts our lives. And this goes to one of the myths that is about self-esteem. It assumes that if you have self-esteem, you don't have any ability, you don't have any tool sets to actually critically evaluate your moral action, the right and wrongness of your actions. And this is not true. Someone who is conscious and in the moment, their reason they're doing that, the reason they're respecting reality is because they know that moral action is the better choice. It is the one that advances their success. It advances their self-esteem. It advances their achievements. It advances their happiness. And so being effectively self-analyzing is an important step. And so you're constantly hungry for the feedback required to give you the best possible course of action in the moment. Does that make sense? So the next pillar is self-acceptance. This is the zealous quest to see ourselves inside and out. This goes also directly to what I was just talking about. The nature of Calvinism is designed to tell you that you can never know yourself. That you will remain an existential mystery to your own existence, which is why you need all these other people to tell you how bad you are. Well, that's nonsense. The fact of the matter is that if you are reality focused, you must learn to be able to successfully evaluate the content of what you are on the inside. Just being honest with yourself. I know what I want and why I want it. Is it right or wrong? Okay, it's wrong. So, I am confronted now with the reality of the choice. What am I going to do? Am I going to be in the moment and aware and take actions in accord with values, or am I going to choose to ignore my values? Self-awareness, self-identification and self-judgment isn't specifically the wrong thing. It's being able to accept the fact that you are where you are in that given instant. Self-acceptance is taking responsibility for our thoughts, feelings, and actions without evasion, denial, or disowning. And without self-repudiation. And this is the common trap that I think gets so many people, why it persuades people so much that pervasive depravity is true. Because contrary to the doctrine, we actually are very aware of what happens on inside of us. We know what we're saying. We know what we're thinking. We understand its moral value and its moral bankruptcy. We see it in action. And so we say to ourselves, in those self-reflecting moments, okay, I know that's wrong. So that must mean, and since I know it's wrong and I still think it anyway, that must mean I'm morally depraved. No, what this means is you have to be able to successfully identify yourself where you are. And accept it is what it is. It isn't a catastrophic moral failing to recognize an error inside yourself. We're not omniscient. We're not omnipotent. And it's a ridiculous moral standard to require of us a level of perfection that is non-existent. It's a myth. We're not judged that way. We need to give ourselves permission to think our thoughts, experience our emotions. They are what they are. Today I'm angry, today I'm sad, today I'm happy, today whatever. It doesn't matter. And look at one's actions without necessarily liking, endorsing, or condoning them. They are what they are. Whatever the specific factors and motivations, they are what they are. My job is to effectively evaluate and accept that that's what they are in the moment. The virtue, and this is the virtue of realism applied to itself. I'm going to have a respect for reality here, and I'm going to have a respect for reality here. Now this is our barometer of moral action. Once we actually can identify ourselves and assess ourselves where we are, then it becomes trivially simple to figure out how to correct our course of action at large. Which is the next pillar of self-esteem. It is self-responsibility. Okay, I've identified an error. Now what am I going to do about it? We are the author of our choices and our actions. No one else is coming to do anything else. If we're taking actions, it's because we are taking the actions. We're responsible for life and our well-being. I'm going to say that again because it's very important. We are responsible for our life and our well-being. We're responsible for the attainment of our goals. If we have decided that we want to reach any achievement, no one else is going to get there. We cannot borrow somebody else's moral action. No matter what the Calvinists tell you, you cannot borrow somebody else's moral action. You cannot borrow somebody else's mind. We're responsible for our attainment of our goals. We're responsible to find ways to exchange value to achieve our goals. This is another crucial thing. If I have a goal that I cannot achieve myself, then it's my job to give somebody else a value to help me get there. They don't have an obligation to help me just because. It's because I possess a value that they want to participate with, and then I get the reciprocal value in return. We are responsible to answer the question, what needs to be done? The thread binding all of these is a respect for reality. It is this respect that Calvinist doctrine seeks to undermine at all cost. I call this spiritual crack. The endless determination to make you fundamentally dependent on their leadership at every turn, in every instant, at every moment. It is designed to make you addicted, to so erode your self-will that you cannot possibly do anything else. It is evil personified. I remember, this is an anecdote, I remember when, some of you may or may not know this, there was a kind of a WikiLeaks style dump when Brent Detweiler was basically outing C.J. Mahaney for blackmailing Larry Tomczak. And there were all these email chains that were going back and forth. And everybody was talking about this blackmail of this, effectively I think it was 16, at the time, his 16-year-old son. And the whole purpose was to get Larry Tomczak to do something that CJ wanted him to do. And I remember vividly reading the blogs, and you could, granted we're reading, but you could almost feel the anguish. And I remember reading this one commenter, and I guess I have the impression it was a man, could have been a woman, I don't know. But his plea was, tell us what we need to do. He was so distraught because he could tell that it was wrong, what had happened, the social dynamic between CJ and CJ's son and Larry Tomczak. He could tell that he knew that there was something morally wrong here with the blackmail. But he had no way to process it, and he was begging, if I remember correctly, I think he was begging Brent Detweiler or telling him what to think about it. I might be wrong about who he was begging, but at the end of the day, he was begging for some leader to tell him how to satisfy his emotional turmoil. And this is a prime example of the kind of thing I'm talking about, the spiritual crack. He had no ability to process the moral value, the moral conclusions in his own right. No human being should ever be in that place. No human being. Calvinists want you to feel helpless in the face of reality. Because if you're helpless in the face of your own reality, you will be very willing to embrace theirs. They want to inspire you to withdraw and escape. They want you to feel hopeless so that you will beg them to make a new reality. The doctrines are designed to make you hold yourself in the highest suspicion. My pastor from many, many years ago, his name was Robin Boisvert. We're talking easily 20, holy cow, 25 years or better? Anyway, it doesn't matter. A long time ago. And I remember when I was first confronting the trend, the move towards Calvinism within then PDI, and as they were evolving into Sovereign Grace Ministries. And he made the comment to me in one of our counseling sessions, John, and I'm paraphrasing, it's not exact, but you'll get the flavor. John, we the pastors doubt you. Why don't you doubt yourself? His entire point was that the reason he couldn't get through to me doctrinally is because I counted too much on my ability to understand the truth. He was basically advancing a doctrine of self-doubt, that I had no moral right to my own individual judgments. And I'm sure you guys can tell, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. They almost had me. It took an enormous amount of work to get out from underneath this body of logic and to see it clearly for what it is. It is fundamentally evil because it is designed to reduce you from the inside out. It's designed to pull you apart at the seams and to make you utterly dependent on what they say. So here's what you do. Take the doctrine seriously. And it will so erode your ability to make a decision, it will render you impotent. Most people intellectually cheat. They smuggle in self-esteem and put on a good face in church. So you'll go home, and particularly this is true of most professionals. So at work, you don't have a choice. You have to operate from an assumption of the Nathaniel Brandon brand of self-esteem at work so you can function at a high level. So you'll go do that there, and then you'll walk through the door of church, and then you'll pretend that you're over here and you're this real committed Calvinist. The problem is they don't mix. You can't have both. And over time, it will erode your commitment to your own capacity and your own achievements to the point that you become functionally useless at your job. So what ends up happening is you take it seriously and you'll lose respect for your own existence. And this is what opens you up for such profound exploitation. Once they have you so doubting your own existence, there is no personal boundary. There is no standard. There's no way to say no. People can do whatever they want to you. What objection can you make? What objection will you make? You don't value yourself enough to draw a boundary or to expect moral action out of anybody else. And this sets up a standard at church that everybody can use you for whatever purpose they want to use you for. And at any point you object, you must be the sinner. You must be the problem. I'm going to tell you again, it's fundamentally evil. So to overthrow their effort, you must fall in love with that which exists. You must fall in love with reality. You must fall in love with reality, and then you must fall in love with your place in reality. You must live consciously, accept the responsibility of your life, and accept yourself. Now, go forth and take action for your own life.